You don't expect your worst date to be the one that almost feels normal. No red flags at first, no dramatic warning signs, just a polite man with an easy smile and a name that sounds ordinary enough to trust. But sometimes the worst love stories don't have red flags plastered all over them. They begin with small details that don't feel wrong until they do. His profile said his name was Gary. That was the first lie. I just didn't know it yet. We matched in early autumn. His messages felt natural and unforced. He wasn't overly eager and wasn't pushy. When he suggested drinks at a local pub, it felt like a casual spot where people often visited, especially at this time of the day. There was nothing unusual about it. When I arrived, he was already there, standing near the entrance with a relaxed smile. He greeted me warmly, like we'd known each other longer than a few days of messaging. For the first hour, everything felt normal. We talked about work, college, and travel stories. He asked thoughtful questions. He listened closely. If anything, he seemed unusually attentive, but I interpreted that as interest. Then something changed. Not dramatically, just subtly. His questions became more specific. He asked about my commute, the cross streets near my apartment, what time I usually get home, whether I lived alone. At the time, I brushed it off. First dates can feel awkward, and sometimes people overshare or ask too much without realizing it. When the bar closed, he suggested we take a short walk. The streets were quiet, and the night air had that crisp autumn chill. As we walked, he stood a little closer than before. He walked a little closer than usual as we crossed the street. It wasn't aggressive, but it felt slightly off. I laughed it off and mentioned I had an early morning shift the following day. He offered to walk me to my car. I refused. He insisted politely. So politely that it felt rude to argue. So I let him. The parking lot was dimly lit and mostly empty. But what unsettled me wasn't the darkness. It was this. He walked directly to my car without me pointing it out. Like he already knew where it was. Like he'd seen me arrive. I told myself I was imagining things. The next morning, I woke up to several messages from him. They felt off. Good morning, Angel. Sent at 6:47 a.m., before my alarm usually went off. Throughout the day, more messages followed. Hope the grocery store isn't too crowded. The blue jacket looked nice on you today. Or enjoy the coffee shop? I hadn't mentioned going to the grocery store. I hadn't told him where I got coffee, and I definitely hadn't told him what I was wearing. At first, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe he'd seen me from a distance. Maybe coincidence was doing what coincidence does. But the messages continued. Late at night, early in the morning, always casual, always friendly, but threaded with details I hadn't shared. It felt intrusive, like someone had quietly stepped past a boundary I hadn't realized was there. Later, I noticed signs that he seemed to know more about my routine than he should have, which made me uneasy. Standing near the entrance, positioned where he could see everyone coming and going, he smiled like it was fate. Small world, he said. The way he looked at me made something lurch in my chest. When I declined his offer to grab coffee afterward, he simply smiled. There was a flicker of something in his expression. Disappointment, maybe. Or calculation. I told myself I was overthinking. A week later, I learned the truth. I had made a casual post in a local women's community group about strange dating experiences. Nothing detailed, just a vague comment about someone knowing too much. Within hours, someone replied. They asked if the man's name was Gary. Then they sent me a link. It referenced a man using that same name online. The report described Gary's pattern: meeting women through apps, gathering personal details, showing up uninvited at places they frequented, watching, creating the illusion of coincidence. One woman had reported seeing him parked outside her apartment multiple nights in a row. No confrontation. No dramatic scene. Just a car sitting quietly in the dark. It felt like I'd been knocked off my feet. I had gone on a date with someone who specialized in digital surveillance. I blocked him immediately. Then I changed everything. My routines, my gym, my routes to work. I adjusted my privacy settings on every social media account. I double-checked my credit reports. I made sure my address wasn't publicly listed anywhere obvious. And at night, I started checking my locks twice. Sometimes 3 times. The worst part wasn't anything he had done outright. It was the fact that he'd adjusted pretty easily to my life and routines. A week after that unnerving encounter at my car, something even stranger happened. I was working late one night on a freelance project in my living room when I noticed a faint flicker from the window blinds. At first, I told myself it was just the streetlights shifting in the wind, but then I heard it. A soft tapping, almost like fingernails brushing against the glass. I froze, my heart hammering. The sound didn't repeat immediately, but it was enough to make me pause and scan the street below. There was nothing. No one. Only the shadows of parked cars and the occasional passing figure far in the distance. I told myself I was imagining things, that stress was making my senses hyper-alert. I tried to focus back on my work, but the unease lingered. A few minutes later, I glanced again and noticed a figure crouched near the corner of the building, partially hidden by the darkness, watching. I couldn't see the face, but the posture, the stillness, the intent focus. It was deliberate. My fingers froze over the keyboard. I considered calling the police, but the figure vanished before I could react. I checked the locks, the doors, the blinds, every single possible entry point. Nothing was disturbed. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had a terrifying thought that someone might have been inside my apartment earlier that day. The next morning, I received a package. I hadn't ordered anything. No return address. Inside was a small keychain shaped like a little coffee cup. Oddly specific. I sat down on the edge of the bed, cold creeping down my spine. How did he know I always grabbed my morning coffee from the same cafe? It was impossible for this to be a coincidence. The message wasn't written. There was no note. Just the object, and the implication that he could reach into my life at any moment without leaving a footprint. I started noticing patterns that were almost impossible to explain. A shadow glimpsed at a corner store, a reflection in a window that seemed to linger a second too long. Every day became a calculated awareness of my surroundings. Every routine doubted. Sleep was disrupted by sudden imagined footsteps, or the possibility of someone quietly walking past the window while I lay in bed. Even the mundane act of walking to the mailbox required constant vigilance. I realized that fear doesn't always come with a scream or a confrontation. Sometimes it seeps slowly, invisibly, like water under a door, and you only notice when it's already soaked the floor. Weeks later, I discovered another report online. A woman in my city had posted about a similar incident. A mysterious package, subtle surveillance, and harmless at first glance but terrifying in implication. Her description matched details only someone who had observed me could have known. I blocked every contact, altered routines, and reinforced my home security. Yet the psychological impact lingered. I never saw him again, but the sense that my privacy could be invaded without warning stayed with me. Over the following weeks, I connected with a few other women who had encountered him. Different names, different profiles, same pattern. One night, about 2 weeks after I blocked him, something happened that I still can't explain. I was in bed, scrolling on my phone, when I heard it. 3 soft knocks on my door. It was well past midnight. I froze. My apartment was silent except for the hum of the refrigerator. Slowly, I crept towards the door and looked through the peephole. The hallway was empty. I stood there for several minutes, barely breathing. Maybe it was someone at the wrong door. Maybe it was the building settling. Maybe it was my imagination, fueled by anxiety. I never saw him again. But the feeling lingered. That sense of being watched, of someone quietly collecting pieces of your life without your permission. Nothing about him was overtly dangerous in a single, obvious moment. That's what made it so unsettling. Months later, I still glance over my shoulder when I walk to my car at night. I still pause before opening my door, listening carefully. I share this not to scare anyone away from online dating. I've met kind, genuine people since then. But I've learned something important. Danger doesn't always come with a red flag. It doesn't always look threatening. Sometimes it smiles across a table, asks thoughtful questions, walks you politely to your car. Sometimes it learns your routines before you realize you've shared them. Trust is powerful, but it should be earned slowly. You never expect your heart to become the target. No sudden alarms, no dramatic confrontation. Just a man who seems to understand you perfectly, whose every word and gesture feels like it was meant only for you. But sometimes the worst betrayals aren't visible. They're carefully constructed, invisible manipulations that shape your reality without leaving fingerprints. It started innocuously. Simon's profile seemed normal enough. A professional-looking headshot, a well-written bio, and mutual interests that matched mine perfectly. We matched one evening, and his first messages were gentle, thoughtful, curious. Unlike others who rushed, Simon seemed measured, deliberate. Every question was designed to seem casual, but there was precision in his timing, in the phrasing, in the way he made me feel like the only person in the world. At first, I didn't see any danger. We exchanged stories about our day, hobbies, favorite books. He commented on little things I mentioned, not as a creep, but as someone genuinely listening. It was flattering, intoxicating even. Slowly, without me noticing, Simon was weaving a connection. A bond built on trust, empathy, and understanding. Then the first subtle sign appeared. He didn't ask for money, nor did he demand favors. Instead, he asked for tiny things: an opinion about a purchase, advice for a friend, insight into how I made decisions. Innocuous, seemingly harmless. But each small detail helped him build a mental map of my routines, my habits, my vulnerabilities. He was practicing social engineering in real time, not for financial gain, but for control, influence, and power over my perception of reality. I would later realize, Simon didn't need force or intimidation. He didn't brandish threats. He didn't need a weapon. He used the very human need for connection, for affirmation, for intimacy. I wasn't losing funds. I was watching the future we had imagined together turn into a carefully scripted performance, a reality crafted to keep me responding exactly as he intended. We began video calls, then longer chats. Every time I laughed, every time I shared a vulnerability, Simon mirrored it, reflected it back to me, making me feel seen and understood. He made me feel like he had known me longer than he really had. Emotional manipulation is subtle. It doesn't scream. It whispers, it suggests, it bends perception until the line between genuine affection and performance blurs. The tension didn't appear in sudden bursts. It came gradually. Simon started to suggest plans, subtly implying that my choices and behaviors could affect our future together. He framed questions and remarks to test boundaries without ever overtly asking for anything. A joke about sharing private boundaries here, a casual suggestion about finances there, all masked in warmth and concern. It felt normal because it was so human, so natural. I began to notice a shift in myself before I noticed it in him. I second-guessed emails, hesitated before making small decisions, felt anxious when I couldn't communicate with him instantly. Simon's influence had become a lens through which I viewed my own life. Every choice, every interaction felt shaded by his potential approval or disapproval. That's the power of emotional manipulation. It convinces you that your reality is intertwined with theirs, and that disagreement or resistance is dangerous. When I later described the situation to friends, I realized the pattern of social engineering he had used was textbook. He gathered data about my routines, my preferences, my fears. He mirrored my emotions to build trust. He nudged me into small compromises until I was psychologically invested. The education here is crucial. Emotional manipulation doesn't leave bruises. It leaves patterns in behavior, subtle changes in how someone perceives themselves. One evening, he sent a message that crystallized everything I hadn't seen before. "I just want us to be aligned." It read. It wasn't threatening. It wasn't coercive in a conventional sense, but it contained the implicit power of expectation, the sense that my feelings, my decisions, my behaviors were part of a performance for his benefit. I realized then that my boundaries had been tested repeatedly, softly, invisibly. My consent had been subtly compromised. By the time I understood the manipulation, I had invested weeks, then months, in someone who was mastering the art of digital trust exploitation. The romance, the connection, the apparent intimacy, they were tools to reshape my perception, to teach me to trust his guidance over my instincts. He wasn't stealing money. He was stealing my trust, my reality, my sense of what was normal in human connection. I began documenting every interaction, dissecting each phrase, each tactic. I saw the architecture of his manipulation: careful timing, emotional mirroring, strategic vulnerability, small tests of compliance, incremental pressure. Everything was deliberate, everything intentional, and yet nothing was illegal. Nothing was overtly malicious in the way law enforcement defines crime. That's the danger. Emotional social engineering can be devastating, and it's often invisible until it's too late. He didn't use a weapon. He used the very human need for connection. I wasn't just losing funds, I was watching the future we built turn into a scripted performance. Eventually, I cut off communication, blocked accounts, and rebuilt routines. But the psychological residue remained. Emotional manipulation leaves traces in perception, in decision-making patterns, in self-trust. It teaches caution. It teaches discernment. It teaches that digital relationships can carry hidden agendas. The lesson, I realized, is not just to be wary of scammers. It's to understand how emotional manipulation works and to recognize its subtle forms. The mirroring are the small boundary tests, the soft nudges toward dependence. You can't always see the danger, but awareness is the shield. You can still feel warmth, connection, empathy, but you need to remain aware that not everyone who seems genuine is acting in good faith. Simon's story is a warning. Digital trust is fragile, and the most sophisticated manipulators exploit the very instincts that make us human. They don't break us with force. They bend perception, craft illusions, and turn kindness, empathy, and desire for connection into tools of subtle control. Even now, I notice the influence of his tactics in stories online, in forums where victims describe the same pattern. Slow trust building, subtle emotional nudging, careful extraction of information, and the creation of a psychological web that makes leaving difficult. Education is key. Understanding manipulation is a form of protection. I share this not as a tale of shame, but as a caution. Romance scams aren't just about money. They're about control, influence, and the theft of one's emotional reality. Awareness, skepticism, and trust in instinct are your tools against them. The digital world may offer endless connection, but it also demands vigilance. I remember the menu, the music, the way we laughed. What I don't remember is how quickly the night changed from ordinary to unsettling. We connected easily at first. Texts were casual, friendly, and warm. He asked genuine questions about my day and seemed genuinely interested in my answers. When he suggested dinner at a well-reviewed cafe, I agreed without hesitation. Nothing about his profile raised alarm bells. No exaggerated photos, no vague job descriptions, no obvious red flags. Just a guy who seemed normal and respectful. The evening started perfectly. Stephen and I met in a busy part of town, exchanged polite smiles, and sat with menus we actually looked at. Conversation flowed effortlessly. He asked about my family, my interests, the little things that make up daily life. The questions were thoughtful, I with follow-ups that showed he was listening. For the first time in a while, I didn't feel lonely. I felt heard, noticed, like someone had genuinely paid attention to me. After 15 minutes, I began relaxing, enjoying the sparks that can fly when two people are naturally drawn to each other. He was warm and considerate. When I mentioned a long week at work, he suggested a quiet spot nearby for dessert, where we could continue talking without the noise of the restaurant. The night air was cool, and we walked slowly, talking about books and travel. I felt a growing excitement about the possibility of something real. Once we arrived at the park after the cafe closed, the atmosphere subtly changed. The benches were empty, the streetlights casting long shadows across the paths. That's when his warmth vanished. His questions became sharp, invasive. He probed in ways that no casual date should, circling around topics I had avoided or politely declined to answer. When I said I had to leave, his smile didn't reach his eyes. It tightened in a way that made the edges of his charm feel dangerous. He wasn't asking me to stay, he was testing the strength of my boundaries. I tried to laugh it off, shifting in my seat and attempting casual responses. He persisted, pressing in with a calm, insistent tone that made me uncomfortable in ways I hadn't anticipated. The evening that had begun with normal conversation now felt like a test. Each refusal I offered was met with subtle disappointment or a small, tightening grin. It wasn't aggression, it was control. I finally excused myself and began walking toward the main street, keeping my steps measured and deliberate. He followed at a distance, still speaking, still pressing with polite insistence. Every word carried weight. Every question felt like a probe, measuring how far he could go before I broke my composure. The quiet park, once serene, became a stage for tension that made my chest tighten and my hands clammy. Once I reached the street, I put more distance between us, keeping to the lit areas and moving quickly. Even from a few steps behind, his presence felt unnervingly close. The charm that had drawn me in earlier was now a tool of subtle intimidation. By the time I reached the corner, the smile had disappeared entirely, replaced by that tight, calculating expression. In the days after, unease didn't fade. I replayed every detail, trying to pinpoint why I felt so unsettled, why I kept glancing over my shoulder when leaving my apartment, why my chest tightened when my phone buzzed unexpectedly. The memory of the park, the way he refused to accept my boundaries, haunted me more than any overt threat could have. Researching his name online, I found reports from other women describing remarkably similar experiences: pleasant dinners, polite conversation, subtle pressure to remain longer, and the lingering sense of being manipulated. There were no dramatic confrontations, no obvious violence, just control, tested patiently, under the guise of charm. Each account echoed my own, revealing patterns that made the normal seem dangerous in hindsight. It struck me then how carefully he built trust, relying on emotional influence rather than overt force. The danger wasn't in shouting or threatening, it was in creating a sense of obligation, It's a quiet pressure that made ordinary actions feel fraught. The risk didn't announce itself with aggression. It hid in polite words, small invasions, and the slow erosion of comfort. Even after official authorities intervened and he was banned from multiple platforms, the memory lingered. The quiet park, the tightening smile, the way my no was tested. These stayed with me. I adopted new habits, like checking my surroundings, trusting instincts more, and never assuming ordinary charm meant safety. I don't share this story for sympathy. I share it as a reminder that danger doesn't always arrive with a bang. It can creep in through charm, through an evening that seems normal until subtle pressure accumulates into fear. The ordinary encounters can hide the extraordinary risk. Even now, I notice behaviors I've learned to distrust: rushed intimacy, subtle insistence, polite testing of boundaries. I've learned to trust the instinct that whispers unease. And I tell this story to reinforce that intuition. Sometimes safety is about noticing what feels off before it becomes unmanageable, because a blind date shouldn't leave you feeling unsafe. Mine did. And I'm still processing how easily charm disguised control, and how close I came to a much worse situation. If there's one thing these stories teach, it's that even ordinary encounters can hide subtle dangers. For more engaging stories like this one, click the subscribe button, and don't forget to like this video to support Deep Horror TV.